This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to hear from social psychologist and author Hugh Mackay AO as we discuss his book, The Kindness Revolution. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Hugh to the Hawke Centre for this live presentation to a full house, and finally, Hugh, the miracle did happen. Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. Now, as we probably all realise and know, Hugh is a social psychologist and the author of 22 books, including 8 novels. He's, extraordinary. His non-fiction writing covers social analysis, psychology, communication and ethics. He has had a 60-year career in social research and was also a weekly newspaper columnist for 25 years. He is a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and the Royal Society of New South Wales, and has been awarded honorary doctorates by 5 Australian universities. I'm thinking, should we make that 6? Yeah? I'll have a talk to the VC. All right, okay. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2015 and is currently an honorary professor in the Research School of Psychology at ANU. Please join me in welcoming Hugh Mackay AO.
Thank you, Jacinta. Thank you very much, Jacinta, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. We say live, but I was live here last year. I just wasn't in person. I wasn't dead. I wonder whether any of you ever find yourselves in despair about man's inhumanity to man. Yes, nods all over the auditorium. Do you sometimes wonder whether these wearying gender wars will ever end? Are you shocked by the level of violence in our society, or by the fact that even after all these years we've failed to achieve true reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? Do you sometimes shake your head in disgust at the behaviour of some politicians in some of our parliaments? More nodding. Are you saddened when you hear people abusing each other? Yes. The answer to all those questions, of course, is yes. And I could go on with a whole lot of other questions, and I'm sure you would nod in response to them as well, because there is a lot of unattractive, ugly, disgusting stuff that goes on in our world and that human beings do to each other. We hear all about that stuff. That makes the news. And we need to remind ourselves regularly that it makes the news because it's news. In other words, the news is reporting unusual things. The news tends to report bad behaviour, tends to report things that are going wrong or are out of control. And not only in the news media, but generally, particularly I think it's fair to say among commentators and intellectuals perhaps, it's almost fashionable to be gloomy, to assume that we're all going to come to a very sticky end, to perhaps adopt a cynical attitude to what's going on in the world, and as things get worse here or there, just to shrug your shoulders and say, I told you so. That's the way humans behave. We're an ugly lot. Well, that is not, it's true, but it's not the whole story, and in fact, it's a very small part of the whole story. We do need to remind ourselves that most of what happens in the world never makes the news, partly because it's too good. Who's interested in hearing that someone helped a frail elderly person across a busy street? That's not news, that's just what we do when we see a frail elderly person struggling to cross the street. Think about all the everyday acts of kindness, compassion, goodwill, cooperation that are going on all around us all the time, and almost always unremarked, certainly unreported in the media, because they are normal. What about the people who do just stop in the street and help total strangers out of some kind of jam, perhaps needing directions or in some kind of trouble? Not a second thought, not a backward glance. We humans just help each other in that situation. What about the people who give up their own ambition in order to support someone else, perhaps a partner or someone with a disability in their family who needs a lifetime of care? What about people who, and you're probably among them, some of you will be doing this, night after night, week after week, year after year. People volunteer their services to help feed the poor and homeless. When there's a flood, when there's a fire, think about the fires at the beginning of 2020, think about the floods in northern New South Wales earlier this year. What happens? Do we humans shrug when people's houses are being burnt down or they're being threatened by an approaching fire, or when they're flooded? Do we shrug? Do we say, that's tough, isn't it? I'm glad I'm not in that situation. No, if we're anywhere within Cooey, we rush to help. And if we can't rush to help, we give in order to provide resources to help people who've been so badly affected. What about people who devote huge chunks of their week to patrolling surf beaches, or training as bushfire fighters, or coaching underprivileged kids' sporting teams, or helping slow readers at the local school, or coaching migrants struggling to come to terms with the English language? What about, in Victoria particularly, but in some other places as well, the thousands of retired school teachers who volunteered their services last year to help coach kids who'd been disadvantaged by homeschooling or no schooling, and it often amounted to much the same thing, during the lockdown. What about those people who late in life plant trees? Isn't that a remarkable thing to do? They're never going to pick the fruit, they're never going to sit in the shade, they're doing it for others, but they're doing it. Now, there's a very short list of lovely things that people do. We could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about all the lovely things that people do, all the way through to those people who I'm sure you know, and I hope you're among them, who would never pass someone in the street without acknowledging that they exist. Just a smile or a wave or a greeting of some kind. Well, it's a very long list, and even the items that I've mentioned should convince you that the good outweighs the bad when it comes to human behaviour. And that shouldn't surprise us, because behaving kindly is an inherent part of what it means to be a cooperative species. And the species we happen to have been born into is characteristically, essentially, a cooperative species. We are a social species. Neuroscientists can now peep into our brains in the way that psychologists and philosophers could previously only speculate about, and they tell us there is actually an identifiable cooperative centre in the brain. In other words, we're hardwired for cooperation, as you would expect of a social species that utterly depends on its ability to create social harmony, to establish families, neighbourhoods, groups, communities, workplaces, schools, all kinds of communities that sustain us and nurture us and provide the emotional security that we all so desperately need, that comes from the sense of belonging. Humans are hopeless in isolation. We desperately need each other, which means we are built, we can talk about some of the things that get in the way of this, but we are built to be each other's neighbours, family members, friends, colleagues, etc. That's our essential nature. Because we need some measure of social harmony in order to survive. So I think that the inbuilt cooperative capacity, which expresses itself mostly as our capacity for kindness, that's the key to cooperation, of course, I think this is our species' most precious asset. And yet, sadly, we often undervalue that asset. We often elbow it out of the way in favour of more ego-driven, competitive impulses. That's all true of us as well. But when we are being true to what Abraham Lincoln described as the better angels of our nature, then we are capable of great kindness. We are capable of drawing on that inherent capacity to be kind and respectful towards each other, even, and here's the most remarkable thing about the human capacity for kindness, we can be kind towards people we can't stand, people we don't like at all, people we could never agree with about politics or religion or culture or literature or art or music or anything. It doesn't matter. We can even, and perhaps this is the most remarkable thing about us, we can even show kindness towards total strangers. But certainly it's important to recognise that kindness does not depend on affection. Samuel Johnson, with whom I don't agree about everything by any means, but 250 years ago he wrote something that I think is very wise and I've used as a sort of opening comment, a quote in my new book. Johnson wrote, "Kindness is in our power even when fondness is not." You can terminate a relationship kindly. You can terminate someone's employment kindly. You can complain to the neighbour about their barking dog kindly. You can have an argument with someone, a robust argument kindly. You can discipline your kids kindly. Kindness is not some kind of soft option. Kindness is a way of being in the world. And for humans, we need to contemplate the possibility of adopting kindness as our default position. Now, I'm not just talking theoretically about kindness. Just think about our recent history. Think about 2020. It seems to me that 2020, the fires followed by the pandemic, was a wonderful example, and there are many, of course, through human history, including Australian history, including quite recent Australian history, certainly the last 100 years. When we draw on our capacity for kindness because of a crisis, because something disrupts our way of life. And almost, not universally, I acknowledge that, but almost automatically, in a crisis, when we're facing some kind of catastrophe, whether it's societal or personal. It might be a relationship breakdown or a life-threatening illness or a retrenchment or a bereavement. Or on a societal scale, it might be a pandemic, or it might be a war, or it might be a fire or flood or some other natural disaster. Generally speaking, in response to those sorts of crises, we behave well. We draw on our natural reserves of kindness. So when I looked at the empty car parks, the empty school playgrounds, the pubs and restaurants being closed, people keeping their distance, people wearing masks and so on, I thought, we're looking at a vast social laboratory here. We've got an opportunity to examine what humans do in a situation like this, at least in our society, not in every society. We can talk about the differences with other societies later, perhaps. But all of that seemed to me to be an outpouring of love. On a massive scale, we showed that we are prepared to make personal sacrifices for the common good. We are prepared not just to do what we're being asked to do. I mean, some of this was regulations and we were obedient. Not all societies around the world were obedient. But of course, we weren't just obedient, were we? How many stories have you heard, either from your own direct experience or from what other people have told you about what happened in their neighbourhoods, about the millions of Australians who went way beyond obeying the regulations and did things in their own local neighbourhoods and communities that went beyond the legal sanctions into humans behaving like humans. People who started looking out for the frail elderly in their street, who they might not have previously paid much attention to. People being suddenly alert to those who might be at risk of social isolation. People offering to do shopping for each other or pick up prescriptions for people who were too ill to get to a pharmacy. And people in particular who were at risk of experiencing loneliness because of the impact of the pandemic. Now, not everyone had that frame. Not everyone said, this is an outpouring of love. Some people, including some people in my own extended family, said, oh, this is really spooky. This is sad. I hate this. Well, I didn't love it, but I loved what it said about us as a community of human beings. Most of us accepted, some people ignored it all, of course, and tried to carry on as if nothing had changed and they were putting their own and other people's health at risk. But most of us did accept the seriousness of the situation and abide not just by the regulations, but respond to the natural human propensity to behave kindly. So an outpouring of love. You might think that's a funny way of expressing it. You might think love is a funny word to use in this context. But what is showing care and concern for each other than a variety of love? What is being prepared to make personal sacrifices for the common good other than an expression of a variety of human love? In fact, I think the love that was on display during the pandemic, and that's still happening, I think it's still on display, is in fact the purest form of human love. Human love, we use the word love. I love my dog, I love chocolate, I love bark, I love this auditorium, I love your scarf, madam. We say love indiscriminately. It's a heavily freighted word. It sort of carries too many meanings. But romantic love, spectacularly exciting. Familial love, remarkable, allowing us to love members of our family that don't always appeal to us. Companionate love. We all utterly rely on the love of friends, companions, the circles that sustain us and, as I've suggested, give us that sense of belonging. But then there's this other form of love which doesn't rely on affection at all, doesn't rely on emotion at all. Is it funny to talk about emotionless love? But that's what kindness is. That's what compassion can be. The love we feel for someone, for whom, the love we show, I should say, for someone about whom we have no particular feelings, positive or especially negative. Now, one of the most impressive things about us humans, I think, is not only our capacity to cope with the difficulties that are placed in our way by our personal circumstances or by societal disruptions, which of course are an inevitable part of being human. These upheavals, these catastrophes come to us perhaps too frequently in some people's lives, but certainly they come to all of us. What's remarkable is not just that we learn from them, but that generally speaking, and again I recognise this sounds like a glib generalisation and there are exceptions, but generally speaking we actually benefit from them. It turns out to be good for us to deal with disruptions and crises, including major catastrophes. I was speaking just last week to a retired American academic who'd worked in London in the 1950s. And he said when he first moved to London, he was initially shocked by the number of people who said to him, you know, we really missed the war. And he thought, how could anyone miss a war? You know, obviously they weren't saying we missed the bombs, we missed the rubble, we missed the death and destruction. What they were saying was we miss the vital sense of a bonded community. We miss the fact that people, without a backward glance or a second thought, were looking out for each other, supporting each other, helping each other. The generation of Australians who lived through the Great Depression, particularly as young adults, establishing their place in the world and starting to raise a family and so on in those years of the early 1930s, hit by a depression the like of which none of us have experienced. They're all dead now, or most of them are, and I spoke to a lot of them in my years of conducting social research, and I heard a recurrent theme in the account that those people gave of what it was like to live through the Great Depression. They said it was absolutely dreadful. People since then have had no experience like the experience of high, sustained unemployment, almost no social security provisions to care for people who were thrown out of work, people worrying almost daily about where the next meal was going to come from, neighbours looking out for each other, pooling their resources, and so on. You wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy, they said. But the other thing they said was that as time passed, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30 years later, they looked back on this very dark period of hardship and deprivation and said, and I heard them say it over and over again, you know, that was the making of us. We learned lessons from that we have never forgotten. Our kids and our grandkids laugh at us because we never throw out a piece of string. We never throw out a rubber band. Waste not, want not has become our mantra, and our austerity is a source of great amusement, particularly to our children. Their children, of course, were typically the baby boomers who had an entirely different set of formative experiences that led them to think life was going to be a breeze. It didn't turn out that way, but it led them to think that the years of growth and prosperity were going to be endless in those decades after the end of World War II. So there's a generation of Australians who were shaped by hardship, as many generations are shaped by war or by other catastrophes. So are we likely to see a COVID effect as we move beyond this phase, and we don't quite know when this phase will end? Has COVID in Australia been sufficiently disruptive, sufficiently unpleasant, sufficiently inconvenient for us to learn some important lessons about what it means to be human? I think it has. And I think the fact that we were disrupted and we did make voluntary, some, as I've said, under the influence of regulations, but mostly voluntary changes to the way we lived, is a very promising sign of the fact that COVID-19 might turn out. I mean, I'm acknowledging that some people have had dreadful health consequences. Long COVID is a reality that we're beginning to learn about from medical authorities. Some people have had an economic catastrophe visited upon them. They've lost small businesses. All that is true. But more generally, I think it's fair to say that here's COVID doing what catastrophes do to humans, namely teaching us some very important lessons about what really matters to us, reminding us about the values that are worth clinging to, perhaps encouraging us to reorder our priorities under the influence of extended periods of lockdown and other revisions to our way of life. More generally, perhaps, underneath all of that, the tendency in our response to COVID is to be a bit more caring, to be a bit more thoughtful of each other, to acknowledge that in the end, we're not individuals. We like to talk as if we are. We've become obsessed with identity, of course, in the last few years. But events like this remind us that identity is interesting to us. It's the way we tell the difference between each other. But actually, what's really significant at a testing time like a pandemic is that we are utterly interdependent, that we all exist in a kind of shimmering, vibrating web of interconnectedness and interdependence. So think about some of the ways in which COVID has already changed you, or your neighbours, or members of your family, or colleagues. I've already mentioned some of the things that have happened in local neighbourhoods where typically, again, not universally, I accept that, but typically people have become a bit more alert to the people in their street or suburb. Early in the pandemic, I found myself trapped in a webinar. That, by the way, is a word which I think should have been strangled at birth. But we all know what a webinar is. And if you're in a webinar, almost certainly you'll be siphoned off at some point into little chat rooms where you'll congregate with a subset of the webinar population. So that happened to me, and I found myself in a chat room with two young men. There were just three of us. They both looked as if they were perhaps in their early 30s. One was in Melbourne, one was in Sydney. And by coincidence, they had each moved into new accommodation just before the lockdown. So they found themselves in a street where they knew no one, and they were forced to stay at home, with the exceptions that we know about. So what did they do? Now, I was intrigued by this because they both did exactly the same thing. They didn't know each other. This is just a strategy that each of them had worked on. Each of them wrote little notes saying, I'm new to the street, I don't know anyone, but here's my phone number. If you need anything, give us a call. I'm happy to do your shopping or pick up your prescriptions or mow your lawn or anything. Just give us a call. Question: would they have done that if we had not been experiencing COVID-19? Almost certainly not. They would have just moved into their new flat, maybe noticed that the neighbours were a funny-looking bunch, maybe said hello to someone. Probably not. Maybe the neighbours would have welcomed them, would have noticed they'd arrived and gone out of their way to greet them. Probably not. Especially in our major cities, less and less of that has been going on. And yet, under the influence of this major disruption, they behaved the way, when you think about it, you'd like people to behave all the time, not just when there's a crisis. I had another example in Melbourne. A friend of mine is a grandmother in Melbourne, and she said early in the first lockdown, she and her daughter and 2-year-old granddaughter every Saturday would go to the local farmer's market, buy a bag of oranges, and in the street where her daughter and granddaughter lived, they would go up and down the street, knocking on all the doors, saying, "Would you like an orange?" The 2-year-old offering the orange, an irresistible offer, of course. "Would you like an orange?" "Yeah, thank you." And they did that week after week through the lockdown. They stopped when the lockdown stopped, but they said, my friend reported that there was a transformation in the life of that street. Not just because they all knew this little girl and her mother and her grandmother, but there was a general thawing in the street, a general sense of, this is a nice thing that's happened, and people smiling and waving and greeting each other more than had previously been the case. Well, they're just a couple of little examples out of the millions of examples that we could describe all around Australia. Other things changed, of course, didn't they? We became much more aware of the risks of social isolation because most of us got a little taste of it, particularly if you live alone and every fourth household, in fact, between every third and every fourth household in Australia now contains just one person. So there are a lot of households in which people were living alone and experiencing social isolation, not just living alone. We know that social isolation is a hazardous thing for members of a social species. In fact, it's so bad for us that in our criminal justice system, we've made solitary confinement the worst form of punishment we can inflict on prisoners, because it is the worst form of punishment for members of a social species, and here we were experiencing it on a massive scale. Why is social isolation so bad for us? Answer, because we are social beings, because it's in our nature to belong, to interact, to have relationships with each other, to talk, to listen, etc. So when we're socially isolated, we are at risk of a number of things happening. The obvious ones: anxiety tends to rise, depression tends to occur, and loneliness tends to occur. Now, I've just mentioned the 3 epidemics that are happening, raging in Australia even before the pandemic, exacerbated, of course, by the lockdown. Epidemics of anxiety, depression, and loneliness are epidemics that follow from a society that had been going through 25 years of social change, tending to fragment us, tending to reduce the sense of social cohesion, promoting a rampant individualism, because in a more fragmented society, that's one of the consequences that follow. Trends like the shrinking household, the high rate of relationship breakdown, our increased busyness, the great barrier to social cohesion, our increased reliance on information technology. There's a long list of factors that have been reshaping our society over the last quarter century, but put them all together, and the cumulative effect of these social changes has been to make us a more atomised, fragmented, hence individualistic society. So that's why we've got epidemics of, that's the main reason, we've got epidemics of anxiety, depression and loneliness. Did you know, just before the pandemic, before the lockdowns, some Australian Psychological Society research had shown that 25% of all Australians reported feeling lonely for most of every week. Quarter of the population struggling with loneliness, and that figure, of course, went up alarmingly during the pandemic. It's not only anxiety, depression and loneliness that tend to flow from prolonged periods of social isolation, but there are physical manifestations as well: hypertension, inflammation, disturbed sleep, increased vulnerability to addictions of all kinds. There's a long list of physical health issues that arise for members of a social species who experience periods of social isolation. So, did we learn from our own perhaps fleeting taste of social isolation what it might be like for people who are generally socially isolated? They might be people in our street who are experiencing social isolation most of the time and running the risk of those health consequences I mentioned. So there's perhaps another way, a good way, we've been changed by that negative experience. It might have made us more alert to the problems of social isolation in our midst. Through the pandemic, of course, we revised our views on the need for travel, didn't we? Because we couldn't. Many of us thought, well, we couldn't do as much travel as we planned, but on the other hand, did we really need to do all that? Might it have been smarter not to? Did we really need to buy all the stuff that we would have bought if we'd been allowed to go shopping in the usual ways? Well, no, perhaps we were in the habit of accumulating more stuff than we really need to accumulate. Working from home changed many people's view of the way they do their work. To everyone's great astonishment, productivity went up when people who work in an office were able to work from home. Bosses discovered that they could trust their employees to get on with the job. Many of the people who were working from home found they were more productive because they weren't spending 2 hours a day stuck in commuter traffic. They were able to be much more single-minded about the work. There were many downsides, of course, and hardly anyone would want to go on working from home exclusively. But now we have a mass movement of people who would like to do a bit more flexible, make a bit more flexible arrangements in the way they work from home sometimes, maybe 3 days a week, and go into the office for 2 days a week and so on. The whole idea that we could live differently, that we could live more simply, was communicated to us under the influence of the pandemic. We made some discoveries about information technology too, didn't we? We all learned about Zoom. I'd never heard of Zoom until March 2020, and then it became a major part of my life. And wasn't it brilliant? And didn't it remind us every time we used it of how far it falls short of the real thing? Our brain struggled to make sense of hours of two-dimensional pictures of the people we thought we were having a meeting with, utterly different as a mental experience from the experience of actually being with other people. Well, we've always known that about technology, but perhaps the pandemic brought home to us that however brilliant it is, it's very much a second best. Another effect of the pandemic, I think, particularly for parents who were struggling with trying to work from home and homeschool their kids, was towering respect for school teachers. I think if teachers want a pay rise, this is the moment. Parents all over Australia are saying, pay them whatever they ask. That's beyond me. But underneath all that, as I suggested a moment ago, perhaps there was a tendency for us to be a little bit more caring towards each other, a little bit more alert to the needs of other people. Now, wouldn't it be a tragedy? In fact, wouldn't it be rather pathetic if, having learned all those things through 2020 and into the early months of 2021, we just forgot them? Wouldn't it be terrible if we did what one of our politicians was urging us to do, namely snap back and just go back to life the way it was, as if we hadn't been through this? I'm very encouraged by the popular use of the term the new normal. If we put the emphasis on new, this is perhaps going to encourage us to think that we could create a normal which has been informed by, enlightened by the lessons we've learned from the fires and from the pandemic. Do we really want to go back to the way we were, too busy, too out of touch with neighbours, too preoccupied with our own agendas and so on? Surely not. Surely this is one of these magic moments in human history that come along from time to time where we are jolted out of our complacency, where we recognise what's been happening to us because there's a bit of a short circuit in that process, and we start thinking, well, we acted differently then. We could go on acting. We could turn the crisis into a revolution. Now, this is all personal that I'm talking about, and I'm optimistic that many of us will make the personal commitment to going on with the lessons we learned from the pandemic. But wouldn't it be fantastic if we multiplied it up and started thinking about some of the societal changes that could occur, not just in our personal lives. In the new book, I've ventured the thought that perhaps if we began to apply some of these lessons in the formulation of policies, social policies, economic policies, etc., Australia could become renowned not as the lucky country, which those of you who ever read Donald Horne's book of that name will know was actually an insult, which we've chosen to accept as a compliment. But we could become renowned not as the lucky country, but as the loving country. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we recognised the inherent capacity for kindness that could not just inform the way we chat to a neighbour or help someone in difficulty, but could actually inform the whole political process? If we were to become a more loving country, if we were to have a kindness revolution, perhaps we would make a more energetic commitment to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Perhaps we would have a more humane response to people who legitimately come here seeking asylum. Perhaps we would make a more determined effort to eradicate homelessness and poverty. Other societies have done that. There is no homelessness in Finland. If you want to know how they did it, I've explained it in detail in the book. We could do exactly what Finland did next week, and we wouldn't have a problem of homelessness. If we were motivated more at the national level by kindness, we wouldn't have homelessness. Perhaps we would then take more urgent action to mitigate the effects of climate change. We might even dream of a time when we could finally grow out of racism and sexism and ageism. A more loving country, a country motivated by kindness, would certainly be more generous towards those for whom we simply do not have enough work, and to people who are struggling with mental illness, disabilities or other debilitating conditions. A more loving country would certainly take better care of our frail aged, would tackle the problem of educational inequality with much more imagination, and would insist on greater civility, particularly in our federal parliament, in the conduct of politics and industrial relations. A more loving country would stop talking endlessly about the economy as if economics were an end in itself, and only ever formulate economic policies in the service of thoroughly debated, well-articulated social goals that those economic policies are designed to serve. A more loving country would certainly put more emphasis on the provision of services to people in desperate need rather than offering the never-ending lure of tax cuts to the already wealthy. Well, do we need a crisis to jolt us into resetting our personal and national agendas? Yes, we seem to. That's characteristic of humans. We get lulled into a feeling of complacency. Well, we're having a crisis. We're being jolted. Are we going to go on with this? If we really wanted to transform Australia into the kind of society we would all like to be part of, where should we start? Let's be intensely practical for a moment. First observation I'd make is we should not look to governments for leadership of the kindness revolution. Revolutions never start at the top. Revolutions start with us making a commitment to living in a different kind of way. But if we were going to make a commitment to living in a different kind of way, what kind of way would it be? Well, those of you who buy a copy of the book later will receive a little card with some very specific suggestions about how we might behave differently, and I'll touch briefly on them in a moment. We're fast running out of time. But let me just identify one thing that we're all capable of doing, not easy, but we're all capable of doing it, that would have a transformative effect and would be an expression of our innate capacity for kindness. And the thing I'd recommend is that we sharpen up our listening skills. that we commit ourselves to becoming more attentive, empathic listeners to each other. Now, why would I suggest that as a first critical step towards a kindness revolution? Well, it's very easy to justify that suggestion. We only need to acknowledge that being members of a social species, as I've mentioned a couple of times, our deepest social need, apart from all our physical needs, our deepest social need is the need to be accepted, to be heard, to be appreciated, to be understood, to be noticed. When that desire to be taken seriously, to be heard, is frustrated, we humans behave very badly, all the way up to violence. But when that desire is being satisfied, we flourish. Now, probably the single most potent demonstration that I take you seriously is when I listen with attention and empathy to what you have to say to me. By listening, I am saying to you, I take you seriously enough to bother listening to what you're saying. And of course, the converse is also true. If I don't listen attentively to what you're saying, if I'm looking at my watch or looking over your shoulder in the hope of catching sight of someone more interesting to talk to, and you know that I'm only half listening, what am I saying to you without ever having to put it into words? I'm saying, sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening to you. Would you ever say that to a partner or a child or a friend or a neighbour or a colleague? Of course not. Yet whenever we withhold the gift of listening, the therapeutic gift of listening, that's in fact what we're saying. So there's my first recommendation. There are other things we can do as well, of course. I mean, we do need to be more attentive to the need to respond to people in other ways, to acknowledge their existence, if not by listening, then at least by smiling and saying hello. We do need to learn to accept people as they are. Remember Samuel Johnson, you don't have to like them in order to be kind to them. We need to be respectful towards everyone, not because they're respectable, but because they're humans, because they are indivisibly a part of this whole that we all belong to. So, list of hints of what we can do can go on, but it starts for any of us with the generous act of listening. By making such a simple thing part of our normal way of living, we could indeed start a revolution. Isn't it time to stop wringing our hands and rolling our eyes about the state of the nation and start doing something to implement the lessons that 2020 has taught us, and perhaps in fact start a revolutionary movement? As the Bengali poet, writer, composer, philosopher Rabindranath Tagore put it, you can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. If we dare to dream of a society motivated by kindness, if we dare to dream of a society that is more compassionate, more cooperative, more respectful, more inclusive, more egalitarian, more harmonious, less cynical. Do you dream of that kind of society? Or do you wake up in the morning and say, when I think about Australia, I just wish there was a bit more violence. I wish we could just be a bit nastier to each other. Why are people so kind all the time? You know, it's sort of creepy. We don't. There's a universal dream, isn't there? We dream of a future with no war. We dream of a future with no violence. We dream of a future, a society in which we are just routinely, without thinking about it, kinder, more respectful, more compassionate towards each other. Well, if that's your dream, there is only one way to start turning the dream into reality. And as I said a moment ago, the revolution will not start at the top. The revolution will start with every individual in each individual in each relationship, in each family, in each street, in each school, in each workplace, deciding to live as if it is that kind of society. And if enough of us start living as if it is that kind of society, that's the kind of society it will become. Now, I want to just wrap this up by reading a very short paragraph from the new book which captures part of what I'm trying to say. Everyone is in need of kindness because everyone walks with shadows. The bereaved with their grief, the arrogant with their deep down insecurities, the believers with their doubt, the lonely with their ache for connection, the uncherished with their fear of insignificance, the ambitious with their vulnerability to failure, the siblings with their rivalry, the bullies with their repressed self-loathing, the errant with their guilt, the anxious and depressed with their dark yearnings, and all those living with the pain of disappointment, frustration, humiliation, rejection, or loss. Kindness is the universal balm for troubled souls, the gift that says, I understand the need for kindness because I share it. To be kind always and to everyone is to be fully, gloriously human. And who wants their humanity diminished by mean-spiritedness? A smile, a wave, an offer of help, a word of encouragement or reassurance, every act of kindness is therapeutic and potentially transformative, and one more step towards a better society. Now, we have just a few minutes left in which we would normally say, are there any questions? But microphone sharing is not permitted in this COVID world we live in. But a few of you have sent in questions, and there are 4. I probably don't have time to do justice to all of them, but let me just quickly run through some of the questions you've submitted and offer a comment. First one was, what advice do you have? I don't give advice, except listen. What advice do you have to leaders of organisations to inculcate a culture of kindness? Well, as always, of course, leadership is a powerful example. If you are running an organisation, large or small, your example will be formative. And in particular, if you are a good listener, you can create a listening culture in your own organisation, and that will be a culture in which kindness is encouraged, because listening is the most potent expression of kindness. The second question was, do I think that reduced biblical literacy in the wider population has an impact on our understanding or otherwise of kindness and how to practice it? That's an enormous question. I mean, the short answer is it probably is a contributor. Kids growing up without the stories about kindness, the teachings of Jesus that in their essence are just about kindness, not about believing in some doctrinal thing, but just about being kind to each other, especially, as he said, especially to people you don't like. But in fact, about 2/3 of Australians actually identify with one religion or another. 52% identify with Christianity. Only about 7 or 8% attend church weekly. There's a big gulf between what people identify as and how they practice. But the fact that they are identifying with it leads me to think that they are identifying with the values that we normally associate with Christianity, or indeed with any religion. I mean, if you ask me what is the purpose of religion in human societies, I would say it is to promote and nurture kindness. It is to teach us how to be compassionate. It is to encourage us to show respect towards each other. Third question, I'm whizzing through these, how can we implement kindness? Yes, I love this. How can we implement kindness without exploiters taking advantage? Now, I want to suggest something that will be perhaps an unpopular response to that question. It is absolutely irrelevant whether exploiters are going to take advantage of us. There is a fashion at the moment in books about personal development, in the business community, there's a fashion for saying, if you want to make yourself feel better, be kind to people. In business, it's expressed as, if you want to improve your bottom line, behave ethically. Good ethics is good business. Being kind makes you feel better. Well, I would like to suggest that you ignore those propositions. That is absolutely anti-virtue. Virtue, as our folklore keeps telling us, the two important things our folklore tells us relevant to today. One is that we grow through pain, isn't that true? And the other is that virtue is its own reward. Virtue is its own reward. Don't then look for a pat on the back if you behave kindly. Don't look for reciprocity. If you behave kindly and someone is unkind in response, or you feel exploited by your kindness, keep being kind. You're not being kind to feel better about yourself. You're being kind to build a better society, to make the world a better place. And it won't always feel good. Someone's shopping bag bursts in the middle of a rainstorm and their stuff goes everywhere. You don't walk past and say, that was tough, wasn't it? You get down on your knees and you help them pick up all the stuff. You're soaked to the skin. You're now running late for a meeting and it's incredibly inconvenient. You don't feel good about yourself. You feel irritated and rather cranky with that person for not controlling their shopping. And how am I going to make up for lost time, and what am I going to do about my wet shirt? Don't expect that doing kind deeds, showing compassion and respect for other people will make you feel good. That's not what it's about. It might, and often will, and sometimes it won't, and it just doesn't matter. And the final question was, are we more competitive these days because we do not get to know our neighbours as we did in the past? I think it's the other way around. Because we are more competitive, more individualistic, as a result of those social trends that I mentioned in my presentation, we have become more rampantly individualistic, and that has made us less neighbourly in our general ethos. It's made our culture a less neighbourly culture. And part of what I'm hoping for with the revolution is that the revolution will actually start at the local. That's how we change a society. We change it street by street, house by house, and gradually the ripples go out and kindness multiplies, as it always does. Thank you.